There we go. Welcome. Exactly at 9:30. That's how long it took me to be able to finally log in. So all praise be to the Most High. Welcome once again. This is Imuna Yisrael. And this is the LEV project, lifting every voice and read. I've been trying to log on to this wild and crazy thing for like the last 30 minutes. So for those who came at 9 o'clock, I was here too. It just didn't work out like that. So praise be to the Most High. Finally, and right at the end of our reading too, let me go ahead and share this for those who were waiting. And I just want to say once again, thank you and welcome. And my computer is all the way bugging out. So let me go ahead and share this. And then we'll get started. I'll try to move through this. Just give me sorry for the delay. Just simple things like acknowledging when stuff mess up, even if it's the technology, makes for good customer service. So let me just put sorry for the delay. Here is the link so that like we came, you weren't here. Okay. All right, boom. Just want to get that documented here. And we shall get started. All right, finally. Woo! Long day, long day, long day. But we are here, so praise be to the Most High. If you're watching this on the rerun, just take a minute to say, how was your day? Ask somebody, how was your day? And even if it was a long day, we still give thanks to the Creator that we're here to see another day. Because all too often, many people, when their time comes, their time comes. So make every day count. We're taking apart an hour a day, or hour every other day to look into our history, but also take the information that we learn on an everyday basis and live in the now, where it is that we understand what's happening with us now and be able to get over hurdles now and heal now. And the past really helps us to do that by giving us real information and clues as to what has happened before us. So once again, I'm still getting over this cold, so it's still a little raspy on the voice, but bear with me. Again, we still open the volunteers. The volunteers is a little shy, I understand. But if you desire to volunteer to read, I would love to hear your voice. We would love to hear your voice. So we're at the end of this book, so let's get started. We're on chapter 17. On the 24th of October, let me catch us up. So he ran away a couple of chapters ago. We observed that he's rather patient and he's very observant. He's been traveling. The last chapter he told us for about 2 months. He's trying to make his way back to Maryland. He was stolen from Maryland in the beginning of the book, sold down south, South Carolina, and then further to Georgia, of which he got a wicked master or mistress, and he couldn't take it no more. He decided he's gonna run away. There's a lot of stuff that happened in the midst of that, but that is the gist. But right now, he's back on his way. So let's see if he gets there. On the 24th of October, according to my computation, in a dark night, I came to a river which appeared to be both broad and deep. Sounding its depth with a pole, I found it too deep to be forded, and after the most careful search along the shore, no boat could be discovered. This place appeared altogether strange to me, and I began to fear that I was again lost. Confident that I had never before been where I now found myself, and ignorant of the other side of the stream, I thought it best not to attempt to cross this water until I was better informed on the country through which it flowed. A thick wood bordered the road on my left and gave me shelter until daylight. Ascending a tree at sunrise that overlooked the stream, which appeared to be more than a mile in width, I perceived on the opposite shore a house, and one large and several small boats in the river. I remained in this tree for the greater part of the day, and saw several persons crossing the river, some of whom had horses. But in the evening the boats were all taken back to the place at which I had seen them in the morning. The river was so broad that I felt some fear of failing in the attempt to swim it. But seeing no prospect of procuring a boat to transport me, I resolved to attempt the navigation as soon as it was dark. Sorry, we all have a little bit of coffee here tonight. About 9 o'clock at the night, having equipped myself in the best manner I was able, I undertook this hazardous navigation and succeeded in gaining the farther shore of the river in about an hour, with all my things in safety. On the previous day, I had noted the bearing of the road as it led from the river, and in the middle of the night, I again resumed my journey in a state of perplexity bordering upon desperation, for it was now evident that this was not the road by which we had traveled when we came to the southern country, and on which hand to turn to reach the right way I knew not. After traveling 5 or 6 miles on this road, and having the North Star in view of all the time, 1 second, please. You okay? 1 second. We got babies on deck. All right, we're back. After traveling 5 or 6 miles on this road and having the North Star in view of all the time, I became satisfied that my course lay northwest and that I was consequently going out of my way, and heightened to my anxiety, I had not tasted an animal food since I crossed the Savannah River. He said he was heightened to his anxiety. He was feeding for the flesh. A sensation of hunger harassed me constantly, but fortune, which had been so long adverse to me and had led me so often astray, had now a little favor in store for me. The leaves were already falling from some of the more tender trees, and tied near the road, I this night perceived a persimmon tree, well laden with fruit, and whilst gathering the fallen persimmons under the tree, a noise overhead arrested my attention. This noise was caused by a large possum, which was on the tree gathering fruit like myself. With a long stick, the animal was brought to the ground, and it proved to be very fat, weighing at least 10 pounds. With such luxury as this in my possession, I could not think of traveling far without tasting it. Wow, he just eat just any. Okay. And accordingly halted about a mile from the persimmon tree on a rising ground in a thick wood, where I killed my opossum and took off its skin, a circumstance that I much regretted, for with the skin I took at least I took at least a pound of fine fat. He's just doing it up right now. Had I possessed the means of scalding my game and dressing it like a pig, it would have afforded me provisions for a week. But as it was, I made a large fire and roasted my prize before it, losing all the oil that ran out in the operation from want of a dripping pan to catch it. It was daylight when my meat was ready for the table, and a very scrumptious, he says, scrumptious breakfast yielding me. I'm sorry. He's over here catching and eating possum. Since leaving Columbia, I had followed as nearly as the course of the road permitted, the index of the North Star, which I suppose would lead me to the most direct route to Maryland. You okay? But I now became convinced that this star was leading me away from the line by which I had approached the cotton country. At the return of night, I resumed my journey earlier than usual, paying no regard to the roads, but keeping the North Star on my left hand as nearly as I could. This night I killed a rabbit which had leaped from the bushes before me. By throwing my walking stick at it, it was roasted at my stopping place in the morning and was very good. I pursued the same course, keeping the North Star on my left hand for 3 nights, intending to get as far east as the road leading from Columbia to Richmond in Virginia. But as my line of march lay almost continually in the woods, I made but little progress, and on the third day, the weather became cloudy, so that I could not see the stars. This again compelled me to lie by until the return of the fair weather. On the second day after I had stopped this time, the sun shone out bright in the morning and continued to shed a glorious light during the day. But in the evenings, the heavens became overcast with clouds, and the night that followed was so dark that I did not attempt to travel. This state of weather continued more than a week, obliging me to remain stationary all this time. These cloudy nights were succeeded by a brisk wind from the northwest, accompanied by fine, clear nights in which I made the best of my way towards the northeast, pursuing my course across the country without regard to roads, forests, or streams of water, crossing many of latter, none of which were deep, but some of them were extremely muddy. One night I became entangled in a thick and deep swamp, the trees that grew in which were so tall and stood so close together that the interlocking of their boughs and the deep foliage in which they were clad prevented me from seeing the stars. Wandering there for several hours, most of the time with mud and water over my knees, and frequently wading in stagnant pools with deep slimy bottoms, I became totally lost and was incapable of seeing the least appearance of the fast land. At length, giving up all hope of extricating myself from the abyss of mud, water, brambles, and falling timber, I scrambled on a large tussock and sat down to await the coming of day, with the intention of going to the nearest highland as soon as the sun should be up. The nights were now becoming cool, and though it did not seem at any frost in the swamp where I was in the morning, I have no doubt that hoarfrost was seen in the dry and open country. After daylight, I found myself as much perplexed as I was at midnight. No shore was to be seen, and in every direction there was the same deep, dreary, black solitude. To add to my misfortune, the morning proved cloudy, and when the sun was up, I could not tell the east from the west. After waiting several hours for a sight of the sun and failing to obtain it, one second. Now he's lost. He don't know where he is. He says, where are we here? I could not tell the east from the west. After waiting several hours for a sight of the sun and failing to obtain it, I set out in search of a running stream of water, intending to strike off any right angles with the course of the current and endeavor to reach the dry ground by this means. But after wandering about through tangled bushes, briars, and vines, clambering over fallen treetops and wading through fens overgrown with sawgrass for 2 or 3 hours, I sat down in despair of finding any guide to conduct me from this detestable place. My bag of meal that I took with me at the commencement of my journey was long since gone, and the only provisions that I now possessed were a few grains of parched corn and near a pint of chestnut that I had picked up under a tree the day before I entered the swamp. The chestnut was full of nuts, but I was afraid to throw sticks or shake the tree, lest hunters or other people hearing the noise might be drawn to the place. About 10 o'clock, I sat down under a large cypress tree upon a decaying log of the same timber to make my breakfast on a few grains of parched corn. Near me was an open space without trees but filled with water that seemed to be deep, for no grass grew in it, except a small quantity near the shore. The water was on my left hand, and as I sat cracking my corn, my attention was attracted by the playful gambols of two squirrels that were running and chasing each other on the boughs of some trees near me. Half pleased with the joyous movements of the little animals, and half covetous of their caresses to roast and devour them. This man. I paid no attention to the succession of sounds on my left, which I thought proceeded from the movement of the frogs at the edge of the water, until the breaking of a stick near me caused me to turn my head, when I discovered that I had other neighbors than spring frogs. A monstrous alligator had left the water and was crawling over the mud with his eyes fixed upon me. See, he wanted them squirrels and that alligator wanted him. He was now within 15 feet of me, and in a moment more, if he had not broken the stick with his weight, I would have become his prey. He could easily have knocked me down with a blow of his tail, and if his jaws had once been closed on a leg or an arm, he would have dragged me into the water, spite of any resistance that I could have made. At the sight of him, I sprang to my feet, and running to the other end of the fallen tree on which I sat, and being there out of danger, had an opportunity of viewing the motions of the alligator at leisure. Finding me out of his reach, he raised his trunk from the ground, elevated his snout, and gave a wistful look, the import of which I well understood. Then turning slowly round, he retreated to the water and sank from my vision. That's the second time he almost got ate up. I was much alarmed by this adventure with the alligator, for I had fallen in with the huge reptile in the nighttime. I should have had no chance of escape from his tusks. The whole day was spent in the swamp, not in traveling from place to place, but in waiting for sun to shine to enable me to obtain a knowledge of various points of the heaven. The day was succeeded by night of unbroken darkness, and it was late in the evening of the second day before I saw the sun. It being then too late to attempt to extricate myself from the swamp from that day, I was obliged to pass another night in the lodge that I had formed for myself in the thick boughs of a fallen cypress tree, which elevated me several feet from the ground, where I believed the alligator could not reach me if he should come in pursuit of me. On the morning of the third day, the sun rose beautifully clear, and at the sight of him, I set off from the east. It must have been 5 miles from the place where I lay to dry land on the east of the swamp, for with all the execration that fear and hunger compelled me to make, it was 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I reached the shore, after swimming in several places and suffering the loss of a very valuable part of my clothes, which are torn off by the briars and the snags. On coming to high ground, I find myself in the woods, and hungry as I was, lay down to await the coming of night, lest someone should see me moving through the forest in daylight. When night came on, I resumed my journey by the stars which were visible, and marched several miles before coming to a plantation. The first that I came to was a cotton field, and after much search I found no corn nor grain of any kind in this place, and was compelled to continue on my way. 2 or 3 miles further on, I was more fortunate and found a field of corn, which had begun gathering from the stalks and thrown in heaps along the ground. Filling my little bag, which I still kept with this corn, I retreated a mile or two in the woods, and striking fire, encamped for the purpose of parching and eating it. After dispatching my meal, I lay down beside the fire and fell into a sound sleep, from which I did not awake until long after sunrise. But on rising and looking around me, I found that my lodge was in less than 100 yards of a new house that people were building in the woods, and upon which men were now at work. Dropping instantly to the ground, I crawled away through the woods until, being out of sight of the house, I ventured to rise and escape on my feet. After I lay down in the night, my fire had died away and emitted no smoke. This circumstance saved me. This affair made me more cautious as to my future conduct. Hiding in the woods until night again came on, I continued my course eastward, and sometime after midnight came upon a wide, well-beaten road, one end of which led at this place a little to the left of the North Star, which I could plainly see. Here I deliberated a long time whether to take this road or continue my course across the country by the stars, but at last resolved to follow the road, more from a desire to get out of the woods than from the conviction that it would lead me to the right place, or the right way, sorry. In the course of this night, I saw but few plantations, but was so fortunate as to see a groundhog crossing, oh, here he go again. A groundhog crossing the road before me. This animal I killed with my stick and carried it until morning. At the approach of daylight, turning away to the right, I gained the top of an eminence from which I could see through the woods for some distance around me. Here I kindled a fire and roasted my groundhog, which afforded me a most grateful repast after my late fasting and severe toils. According to custom, my meal being over, I betook myself to sleep and did not wake until the afternoon. When descending a few rods down the hill and standing still to take a survey of the woods around me, I saw at the distance of a half mile from me, sorry, a man moving slowly about in the forest and apparently watching like myself to see if anyone was in view. Looking at this man attentively, I saw he was black and that he did not move more than a few rods from the same spot where I first saw him. Here he goes now. Curiosity impelled me to know more of the condition of my neighbor and descended quite to the foot of the hill. I perceived that he had a covert of boughs of trees under which I saw him pass, and after some time return again from his retreat. Examining the appearance of things carefully, I became satisfied that though stranger was like myself, a Negro slave, and I determined without more ceremony to go and speak to him, for I felt no fear of being betrayed by one as badly off in the world as myself. When this man first saw me at the distance of 100 yards from him, he manifested great agitation and at once seemed disposed to run from me. But when I called to him and told him not to be afraid, he became more assured and waited for me to come close to him. I found him to be a dark mulatto, small and slender in person and lame in one leg. He had been well bred and possessed good manners and fine address. I told him I was traveling, presumed this was not his dwelling place, upon which he informed me that he was a native of Kent County in the state of Delaware and had been brought up as a house servant by his master, who on his deathbed had made his will and directed him to be set free by his executors at the age of 25, and that in the meantime he would be hired out as a servant to some person who should treat him well. Well, soon after the death of his master, the executors hired him to a man in Wilmington who employed him as a waiter in his house for 3 or 4 months, and then took him to a small town called Newport and sold him to a man who took him immediately to Baltimore, where he was again sold or transferred to another man who brought him to South Carolina and sold him to a cotton planter with whom he had lived more than 2 years and had run away 3 weeks before the time I saw him with the intention of returning to Delaware. That being lame and becoming fatigued by travel, he had stopped here and made his shelter on boughs of barks of trees, under which he had remained more than a week before I met him. He invited me to go into his camp, as he termed, where he had an old skillet, more than a bushel of potatoes, and several fowls, all of which he said he had purloined from the plantations in the neighborhood. The encampment was in a level open wood, and it appeared surprising to me that its occupant had not been discovered and conveyed back to his master before this time. I told him that I thought he ran great risk of being taken up by remaining here, and advised him to break up his lodge immediately and pursue his journey, traveling only in the night. He then proposed to join me and travel in company with me, but this I declined because of his lameness and great want of discretion, though I did not assign these reasons to him. He's like, nah, you can't roll with me. I remained with this man 2 or 3 hours and ate dinner of fowls dressed after his rude fashion before leaving him. He dissing his, I can't with Charles. I pressed upon him the necessity of immediately quitting the position he then occupied, but he said he intended to remain there a few days longer unless I would take him with me. On quitting my new acquaintance, I thought it prudent to change my place of abode for the residue of this day, and removed along the top of the hill that I occupied at least 2 miles, and concealed myself in a thicket until night. When returning to the road I had left in the morning and traveled hard all night, I came to a large stream of water just at the break of day. As it was too late to pass the river with safety this morning at this ford, I went half a mile higher and swam across the stream in open daylight at a place where both sides of the water were skirted with woods. I had several large potatoes that had been given to me by the man at this camp in the woods, and these constituted my rations for this day. At the rising and setting of the sun, I took the bearing of the road by the course of the stream that I had crossed, and found that I was traveling to the northwest instead of the north or northeast, to one of which later points I wished to direct my march. Having perceived the country in which I now was to be thickly peopled, I remained in my resting place until late at night, when returning to the road and crossing it, I took once more to the woods with the stars for my guides and steered for the northeast. This was a fortunate night for me in all respects. The atmosphere was clear, the ground was high, dry, free from thickets. In the course of the night, I passed several cornfields, with the corn still remaining in them, and passed a potato lot, in which large quantities of fine potatoes were dug out of the ground and lay in heaps covered with vines. But my most signal good luck occurred just before day, when passing under a dogwood tree and hearing a noise in the branches above me, I looked and saw a large possum among the berries that hung upon the boughs. The game was quickly shaken down and turned out as fat as a well-fed pig and as heavy as a full-grown raccoon. My attention was now turned to searching for a place in which I could secrete myself for the day and dress my provisions in quietness. The day was clear and beautiful until the afternoon, when the air became damp and the heavens were overhung with clouds. The night that followed was dark as pitch and compelled me to remain in the camp all night. The next day brought with it a terrible storm of rain and wind that continued with but little intermission more than 24 hours, and the sun was not again visible until the third day. Nor was there a clear night for me for more than a week. During all this time I lay in my camp and subsisted upon the provisions that I had brought with me to this place, the corn and potatoes looking so tempting when I saw them in the fields, that I had taken more than I should have consumed, had not been the bad weather compelled me to remain at this spot. But it was well for me for this time that I had taken more than I could eat in 1 or 2 days. At the end of the cloudy weather, I felt more refreshed and strengthened, and resumed my journey in high spirits, although I now began to feel the want of shoes, those which I wore when I left my mistress having long since been worn out, and my boots were wrapped straps of hickory bark about my feet to keep the leather from separating and falling into pieces. I was now by my computation it was now by my computation the month of November, and I was yet in the state of South Carolina. I began to consider myself whether I had gained or lost by attempting to travel on the roads, and after revolving in my mind all the disasters that had befallen me, determined to abandon the roads altogether for 2 reasons. The first of which was that on the highways I was constantly liable to meet persons or to be overtaken by them. And a second, no less powerful, was that as I did not know what roads to pursue, I was often traveling on the wrong route than on the right one. Last paragraph of the 17th chapter. Setting my face once more for the North Star, I advanced with a steady, though slow pace for 4 or 5 nights, when I was again delayed by dark weather and forced to remain in idleness nearly 2 weeks. And when the weather again became clear, I was arrested on the second night by a broad and rapid river that appeared so formidable that I did not dare to attempt its passage until examining it in daylight. On the succeeding night, however, I crossed it by swimming, resting at some large rocks near the middle. After gaining the north side of this river, which I believed to be Catawba, I considered myself in North Carolina and again steered towards the north. And we're going to go right into, that was the end of the 17th chapter, and we're going to go right into the 18th chapter. He is traveling for like 3 months now, and he's meeting adversity. So let's see what happens. It says the month of November is in all years a season of clouds and vapors. But at the time of which I write, the good weather vanished early in the month, and all the clouds of the universe seem to have collected in North Carolina. From the second night after crossing the Catawba, I did not see the North Star from the space of 3 weeks. And during all this time, no progress was made in my journey, although I seldom remained 2 days in the same place, but moved from one position to another for the purpose of eluding the observation of people of the country, whose attention might have been attracted by the continual appearance of smoke of my fires in one place. There had as yet been so hard frost, and the leaves were still on the oak trees at the close of this cloudy weather, but the northwest wind, which dispelled the mist, also brought down nearly all the leaves of the forest, except those of the evergreen trees, and the nights now became clear, and the air clean with frost. Hitherto the oak woods had afforded me the safest shelter, but I was obliged to seek the groves of young pines to retire to at dawn. Hitherto, I had found a plentiful subsistence in every cornfield and potato lot that fell in my way, but now began to find some of the fields in which corn had grown destitute of corn and containing nothing but the stalks. The potatoes had all been taken out of the lot where they grew, except in some few instances where they had been buried in the field, and the means of subsistence became every day more difficult to be obtained. But as I had fine weather, I made the best use of these hours in which I dared to travel, and was constantly moving from a short time after dark until daylight. The toil that I underwent for the first half of the month of December was excessive, and my sufferings from want of food were great. I was obliged to carry with me a stock of corn sufficient to supply me for 2 or 3 days, for it was frequently happened that I met with none in the fields for a long time. In the course of this period, I crossed innumerable streams, the greater portion of which were of a small size, but some were considerable magnitude. And in all of them, the water had become almost as cold as ice. Sometimes I was fortunate enough to find boats or canoes tied at the side of streams, and when this happened, I always made free use of that which no one else was using at the time. But this did not occur often, and I believe that in these 2 weeks I swam over 9 rivers or streams so deep that I could not ford them. The number of creeks and rivulets through which I waded was far greater, but I could not fix the number. How many people would have gave up by now? This dude is determined. I'm not mad at you, Charles. And one of these fine nights, passing near the house of a planter, I saw several dry hides hanging on poles under a shed. One of these hides I appropriated to myself for the purpose of converting into moccasins to supply the place of my boots, which were totally worthless. By beating the dry hide with a stick, it was made sufficiently pliable to bear making it into moccasins, of which I made for myself 3 pair, wearing one, carrying the others on my back. One day, as I lay in a pine thicket, several pigs, which appeared to be wild, having no marks on their ears, came near me, and one of them approached so close without seeing me that I knocked it down with a stone, and succeeding in killing it. This pig was very fat and would have weighed 30, if not 40 pounds. Feeling now greatly exhausted with the fatigue that I had lately undergone, and being in a very great forest far removed from white inhabitants, I resolved to remain a few days in this place and regale myself with the flesh of the pig, which I preserved by hanging it up in the shade after cutting it into pieces. He says, fortune so adverse to me hitherto seemed to have been more kind to me at this time. For the very night succeeded the day of which I killed the pig, a storm of hail, snow, and sleet came on, and continued 15 or 16 hours. The snow lay on the ground 4 inches in depth, and the whole country was covered with a crust almost hard enough to bit a man. In this state of weather I could not travel, and my stock of pork was invaluable to me. The pork was frozen where it hung on the branches of the trees, and was well preserved as if it were buried in snow. But on the 4th day after the snow fell, the atmosphere underwent a great change. The wind blew from the south, the snow melted away, the air became warm, and the sun shone with brightness, and almost with the warmth of spring. It was manifest that my pork, which was now soft and oily, would not long be in a sound state if it remained here. My provisions would become putrid of my hands in a short time, and compel me to quit my residence to avoid the atmosphere of the place. I resolved to pursue my journey, and prepared myself by roasting before the fire all of the pork that was left, wrapping it up carefully in the green pine leaves, and enveloping the whole in a sort of closed basket that I made of small boughs of trees. Equipping myself for the journey with my meat in my knapsack, I again took to the woods with the stars for my guide, keeping the North Star over my left eye. The weather had become exceedingly variable, and I was seldom able to travel more than half of the night. The fields were muddy, the low ground in the woods were wet, and often covered with water, through which I was obliged to wade. The air was damp and cold by day. The nights were frosty, even often covering the water with ice an inch in thickness. From the great degree of cold that prevailed, I inferred either that I was pretty far north, or that I had advanced too much to the left and was approaching the mountain country. I satisfied myself as far as possible of my situation. One fair day, when the sky was very clear, I climbed to the top of a pine tree that stood on the summit of a hill, and took a wide survey of the region around me. Eastward I saw nothing but a vast continuation of plantations, intervened by forests on the south. The faint beams of a winter sun shed a soft luster over the woods, which were dotted at remote distances with the habitations of men, and the openings they had made in green champaign of the endless pine groves that nature had planted in the direction of the midday sun. On the north, at a great distance, I saw a tract of low and flat country, which was, in my opinion, was the vale of some great river, and beyond this, at the farthest stretch of the vision, the eye was lost in the blue transparent vault, whether the extremity of the arch of the world touches the abode of perpetual winter. Turning westward, the view passed beyond the region of pine trees, which was followed afar off by naked and leafless oaks, hickories, and walnuts, and still beyond those rose high in the air elevated tracts of country clad in the white livery of snow and bearing the impression of midwinter. Dude has been out there for a long time. Winter is upon him, and he's outside in the cold, as many of our people are today, homeless and outside weathering the cold without protection. It was now apparent that I had borne too far westward, and was within a few days' travel of the mountains. Descending from my observation, I determined on the return of night to shape my course for the future nearly due east, until I should at least be out of the mountains. According to my calendar, it was the day how he just keep it he is a trip. According to his calendar, it was the day before Christmas or Xmas that I ascended the pine tree, and I believed it was at the time in the northwestern part of the North Carolina, not far from the banks of the Yadkin River. On the following night, I traveled from dark until as I suppose, about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, when I came to a road which was led, as I thought, in an easterly direction. This road I traveled until daylight and encamped near it an old field overgrown with young pines and holly trees. This was Christmas Day, he says, and I celebrated it by breakfasting on fat pork without salt and substituted parched corn for bread. In the evening, the weather became cloudy and cold, and when night came, it was so dark that I found difficulty in keeping in the road at some points where it made short angles. Before midday, before midnight, it began to snow. And at daybreak, and at break of day, the snow lay more than a foot deep. This compelled me to seek winter quarters, and fortunately, at about a half a mile from the road, I found myself, he didn't find himself. I found on the side of a steep hill a shelving rock that formed a dry covert with a southern prospect. Under this rock, I took refuge and kindled a fire of dry sticks, considered myself happy to possess a few pounds of my roasted pork and more than a half a gallon of corn that I carried in my pockets. The snow continued falling until it was full 2 feet deep around me, and the danger of exposing myself to discovery by my tracks in the snow compelled me to keep close to my hiding place until the third day, when I ventured to go back to the road, which I found broken by the passage of numerous wagons, sleds, and horses, and so much beaten that I could travel it with ease at night, the snow affording good light. Accordingly, at night, I again advanced on my way, which indeed I was obliged to do, for my corn was quite gone, and not more than a pound of my pork remained to me. I traveled hard through the night, and after the morning star rose, came to a river, which I think must have been the Yadkin. Didn't he pass that one already? It's all right. It appeared to be about 200 yards wide, and the water ran with great rapidity in it. He's about to pass some freezing cold water, waiting until the eastern horizon was tinged with the first rays of morning light. I entered the river at the ford and waited until the water was nearly 3 feet deep, when it felt as if it was cutting the flesh from the bones of my limbs, and a large cake of ice floating downward forced me off balance, and I was nearing falling. I was near falling. My courage failed me, and I returned to the shore, but found the pain that already tormented me greatly increased. Yeah, he's freezing, hypothermia, when I was out of the water and exposed to the action of the open air. Returning to the river, I plunged into the current to relieve me from the pinching frost that gnawed every part of my skin that had become wet, and rushing forward as fast as the weight of the water that pressed me downward would permit, was soon up to my chin in melted ice. When rising to the surface, I exerted my utmost strength and skill to gain the opposite shore by swimming in the shortest space of time. At every stroke of my arms and legs, they were cut and bruised by cakes of solid ice, or weighed down by floating masses of congealed snow. It is impossible for human life to be long sustained in such an element at that which encompassed me, and I had not been afloat 5 minutes before I felt chilled in all my members, and in less than double of that time my limbs felt numb, and my hands became stiff and almost powerless. Yeah, he catching hypothermia right about now. Sorry, that's the Muna commentary. When at the distance of 30 feet from the shore, my body was struck by a violent current produced by a projecting rock above me and driven with resistless violence down the stream. Wholly unable to contend with the fury of the waves and penetrated by the coldness of death, in my inmost vitals I gave myself up for lost and was commending my soul to God, whom I expected to be my immediate judge. And when I perceived the long hanging branch of a large tree sweeping to and fro and undulating backwards and forward, as its extremities were washed by the surging current of the river just below me, in a moment I was in contact with the tree, and making the effort of despair seized one of its limbs. Bowed down by the weight of my body, the branch yielded to the power of the water, with rushing against my person, swept me round the quadrant of a circle and dashed me against the shore. where clinging to some roots that grew near the bank, the limb of the tree left me, and springing with elastic force to its former position again, dipped its slender branch into the mad stream. Wow. He was like, that's it, I'm done. That's the first time I heard him say that. Like, okay. Crawling out of the water and being once more on dry land, I found my circumstance little desperate than when I was struggling with the floating ice. The morning was frosty, and icicles hung in long pendant groups from the trees along the shore of the river, and the hoarfrost glistened in sparkling radiance upon the polished surface of smooth snow as it whitened all the plain before me and spread its chill but beautiful covering through the woods. There were three alternatives before me, one of which I knew most quickly be adopted. The one was to obtain a fire, by which I would dry and warm my stiffened limbs. The second was to die without the fire. The third was to go to the first house, if I could reach one, and surrender myself as a runaway. Oh, man. Staggering rather than walking forward until I gained the cover of a wood at a short distance from the river, I turned into it and found that a field bordered the wood within less than 20 rods of the road. Within a few yards of this fence, I stopped, and taking out my fire apparatus, to my unspeakable joy, found them dry and in perfect safety, with the aid of my punk and some dry moss gathered from the fence. A small flame was obtained, to which dry leaves, being added from the boughs of white oak tree, had fallen before the frost of the last autumn had commenced. I soon had a fire of sufficient intensity to consume dry wood, with which I supplied it, partly from the fence and partly from the branches of the fallen tree. Having raked away the snow from about the fire, by the time the sun was up, my frozen clothes were smoking before the coals, warming first one side and then the other. I felt the glow of returning life once more, invigorating my body, blood, and giving animation to my frozen limbs. The public road was near me on one hand, and an enclosed field was before me on the other. But in my present condition, it was impossible for me to leave this place today without danger of perishing in the woods or of being arrested on the road. As evening came on, the air became much colder than it was in the forenoon, and after night the wind rose high and blew from the northwest with intense keenness. My limbs were yet stiff from the effects of my morning adventure, and to complete my distress, I was totally out of provisions, having left a few ears of corn that I had in my pocket on the other side of the river. Leaving my fire in the night and advancing into the field near me, I discovered a house at some distance, and as there was no light or sign of fire, I determined to, I don't even know this word, reconnoiter the premises, which turned out to be a small barn standing alone, with no other inhabitants about than a few cattle and a flock of sheep. After much trouble, I succeeded in entering the barn by starting the nails that confined on the boards at the corner. Entering the house, I found it nearly filled with corn in the husk, and some from which the husk had been removed was laying in a heap in one corner. Into these husks I crawled and covered myself deeply under them, soon became warm and fell into a profound sleep, from which I was awakened by the noise of people walking about in the barn, and talking of the cattle and sheep, which it appeared they had come to feed, for they soon commenced working in the corn husks with which I was covered and throwing them out to the cattle. I expected at every moment that they would uncover me, but fortunately before they saw me, they ceased their operation and went to work, some husking corn and throwing the husk on the pile over me, while others were employed in loading the husk corn in carts, as I learned by their conversation, and hauling it away to the house. The people continued working in the barn all day, and in the evening gave more husk to the cattle and went home. Oh my goodness. Sorry about that. Waiting 2 or 3 hours after my visitors were gone, I rose from the pile of husk and filled my pockets with ears of corn, issued from the barn at the same place by which I had entered it, and returned to the woods, where I kindled a fire in a pine thicket and parched more than a half-gallon of corn. Before day, I returned to the barn and again secreted myself in the corn husk. In the morning, the people again returned to their work and husked corns until the evening. At night, I again repaired to the woods and parched more corn. In this manner, I passed more than a month, lying in the barn all day and going to the woods at night. But at length, the corn was all husked, and I watched daily the progress that was made in feeding the cattle with the husk, knowing that I must quit my winter retreat before the husks were exhausted, before the husk corn was removed from the barn. I had conveyed several bushels of ears into husks near my bed and concealed them from my winter stock. He took up residence in the people's barn. While I lay in this barn, there were frequent and great changes of weather. The snow that covered the earth to the depth of 2 feet when I came here did not remain more than 10 days. Sorry, I skipped the page. And was succeeded by more than a week of warm, rainy weather, which was in turn succeeded by several days of dry weather, with cold winds from the north. The month of February was cloudy and damp, with several squalls of snow and frequent rains. And the 1st of March, the atmosphere became clear and dry, and the winds boisterous from the west. I'm going to pause right here. We have a little bit to go. I need to drink a little tiny bit of water, and then we're going to finish up this chapter, because on Sunday, the Most High will, we're going to be finished the book. So if you just stick with me, I know it's a little bit late. I'm not going to be going long. I'm going to play you like half a song, and I'll be right back. Thank you for sticking with us. One moment. I hear a baby coughing in there, so I'm going to run really quickly, get a little bit of water, and be right back.
Why would people in the condition of poverty and slavery, Facebook, jack-up mentality? Blind eyes can't see, no, blind eyes don't see. We find it in the Genesis. Make me try back and try to understand this. A man named Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the house. 12 sons with enough children. 70 souls was all of them. Gone down in Egypt, the bound to fly. Word of the Most High, who that never lie. After much time, remember them. Moses down there, so we deliver them. There was only one problem. Say only one problem. Is the love them idolatry, them captivity, them poverty and idolatry. Why do the people perish? Do you understand it? The feminists will ask the Most High, 'cause we really want to understand why. Why do the people perish? Do you understand it? Go on your knees and ask the Most High if you really want to understand why. When them walk out, them was unfaithful. When them walk out, them was unfaithful. Made a covenant, them never really keep it. Said the words, but them never really mean it. Mount Sinai was not a secret. 10 words, glory, we did see it. What's wrong with Israel? What's wrong with Israel? Why do the people?
All right, I am back. I had to get a little water. Sorry, thank you for sticking with me. This is getting interesting. He really wanted to be free. You know, this is the first time we see him really contemplating. He nearly froze to death, hypothermia. It just shows you how much our foreparents were willing to go through. But it also shows you some other things too. We could talk about that as well. but I'm going to go ahead and finish this up for those who have to go to work in the morning. It says, on the 3rd of this month, having filled my little bag and my pockets with parched corn, I quitted my winter quarters about 10 o'clock at night and again proceeded on my way to the north, leaving a large heap of corn husks still lying in the corner of the barn. On leaving this place, I again pursued the road that had led me to it for several nights, crossing many small streams in my way, all of which I was able to pass without swimming, though several of them were so deep that they wet me as high as my armpits. This road led nearly northeast and was the only road that I had fallen in with since I left Georgia that had maintained that direction for some great distance. Nothing extraordinary befell me until the 12th of March. My goodness, March? What in the world? I'm sorry, he went from December to March. He just threw that in there. When venturing to turn out earlier than usual in the evening and proceeding along the road, I found that my way led me down a hill along the side of which the road had been cut into the earth, 10 or 12 feet in depth, having steep banks on each side, which were now so damp and slippery that it was impossible for a man to ascend either the one side or the other. Whilst I was in this narrow place, I heard the sound of these horses proceeding up the hill to meet me. Stopping to listen, in a moment, almost 2 horsemen were close before me, trotting up the road. To escape on either hand was impossible, and to retreat backward would have exposed me to certain destruction. Only one means of salvation was left, and I embraced it. Near the place where I stood was deep gully cut in one side of the road, but the water which had run down here in time of rain. Into this gully I threw myself, and lying down close to the ground, the horsemen rode almost over me and passed on. When they were gone, I arose and descended the hill, found a river before me. In crossing this stream, I was compelled to swim at least 200 yards and found the cold so oppressive after coming out of the water that I was forced to stop at the first stick of woods that I could find and make a fire to dry myself. I did not move again until the next night, and on the 4th night after this came to a great river, which I suppose was the Roanoke. I was obliged to swim the stream and was carried a great way down by the rapidity of the current. It must have been more than an hour from the time that I entered the water until I reached the opposite shore, and as the rivers were yet very cold, I suffered greatly at this place. Judging by the aspect of the country, I believed myself to be at this time in Virginia, and was now reduced to the utmost extremity for want of provisions. The corn that I had parched at the barn and brought with me was nearly exhausted, and no more was to be obtained in the fields at this season of the year. For 3 or 4 days, I allowed myself only my 2 handfuls of parched corn per day, and after this I traveled 3 days without tasting food of any kind. But being nearly exhausted with hunger, I one night entered an old stackyard, hoping that I might fall in with pigs or poultry of some kind. I found instead of these a stack of oats, which had not been threshed from the sack. I took as much oats in the sheaf as I could carry, and going on a few miles, stopped in the pine forest, made a large fire, parched at least half a gallon of oats. After rubbing the grain from the straw, after, after the grain was parched, I again rubbed it in my hands to separate it from the husk, and spent the night in feasting on parched oats, what they call today like granola, kind of like baked oats. The weather was now becoming quite warm. Though the water was cold in the rivers, and I perceived the farmer had everywhere plowed their field, preparatory to planting corn. Every night I saw people burning bushes in the new grounds that were clearing of the wood and brush. And when the day came in the morning after I obtained the oats, I perceived people planting corn in a field about half a mile from my fire. According to my computation of time, it was on the night of the last day of March that I obtained the oats, and the appearance of the country satisfied me that I had not lost many days in my reckoning. I lay in this pine wood 2 days for the purpose of recruiting my strength after my long fast, and when when I again resumed my journey, determined to seek some large road leading towards the north and follow it in future. The one that I have been pursuing of late not appearing to be a principal highway of the country. For this purpose, striking off across the field in an earnest easterly direction, I traveled a few hours and fortunate enough to come to a great road, which was manifestly much traveled, leading towards the northeast. My bag was now replenished with more than a half-gallon of parched oats, and I had yet one pair of moccasins made of raw hide, but my shirt was totally gone, and my last pair of trousers was now in actual service. A tolerable waistcoat still remained to me, and my greatcoat, though full of honorable scars, was yet capable of much service. Having resolved to pursue the road I was now in, it was necessary again to resort to the utmost degree of caution to prevent surprise, traveling only after it was dark and taking care to stop before the appearance of day. My progress was not rapid, but my safety was preserved. The acquisition of food had now become difficult, and when my oats began to fail, I resorted to the dangerous expedition of attacking the corn crib of a planter that was near the road. The house was built of round logs and was covered with boards. One of these boards I succeeded in removing on the side of the crib opposite from the dwelling, and by thrusting my arm downward was able to reach the corn, of which I took as much as filled my bag. The pockets of my greatcoat and the large handkerchief that I preserved through all, what is this? Vicissitudes. I gotta look that word up. Of my journey. This opportune supply of corn furnished me with food more than a week, and before it was consumed, I reached the Appomattox, no, Appomattox River. Sorry if I jacked that up. Appomattox River, which I crossed in a canoe that I found at the shore, tied at the shore, a few miles above the town of Petersburg. Having approached Petersburg in the night, I was afraid to attempt to pass through it, lest the patrol should fall in with me, and turn to left through country, reached the river, and crossed it safely. The great road leading to Richmond is so distinguishingly marked above the other ways in this part of Virginia that there was no difficulty in following it. And on the third night after passing Petersburg, I obtained a sight of the capital of Virginia. It was only a little after midnight when the city presented itself to my sight. But here, as well as Petersburg, I was afraid to attempt to go through the town under cover of darkness because of the patrol. Turning therefore back into the forest about 2 miles from the small town on the south side of the river, I lay there until after 12 o'clock in the day, when loosening the package from my back and taking it in my hand in the form of a bundle, I advanced into the village as if I had only come from some plantation in the neighborhood. This was Sunday, I believe, though according to my computation it was Monday, but it must have been Sunday, for the village was quiet, and in passing it I only saw 2 or 3 persons whom I passed as if I had not seen them. No one spoke to me, and I gained the bridge in safety and crossed it without attracting the least attention. Entering the city of Richmond, I kept along the principal street, walking a slow pace and turning my head from side to side, as if much attracted by objects around me. Few persons were in the street, and I was careful to appear more attentive to the houses than the people. At the upper end of the city, I saw a great crowd of ladies and gentlemen who were, I believe, returning from church. Whilst these people were passing me, I stood in the street on the opposite side of the foot pavement with my face turned to the opposite side of the street. I lost my place. On the opposite side of the street. They all went by without taking any notice of me, and when they were gone, I again resumed my leisure walk along the pavement and reached the utmost limit of the town without being accosted by anyone. As soon as I was clear of the city, I quickened my pace and assumed the air of a man in great haste, sometimes actually ran, and in less than an hour was safely lodged in the thickest part of the woods that lay on the north of Richmond, and full 4 miles from the river. This was the boldest exploit that I had performed since leaving my mistress, except the visit I paid to the gentleman in Georgia. My corn was now failing, but as I had once entered a crib secretly, I felt but little apprehension of the count of my future supplies. After this time, I never wanted corn and did not again suffer by hunger until I reached the place of my nativity. After leaving Richmond, I again left along a great road by which I had traveled on my way south, taking care not to expose my person unnecessarily. For several nights, I saw no white people on the way, but was often met by black ones whom I avoided by turning out of the road. But one moonlit night, 5 or 6 days after I left Richmond, a man stepped out of the wood almost at my side and accosted me in a similar manner, asked me why I was traveling and how long I had been on the road, and made many inquiries concerning the course of my late journey. Nosy now. This man was a mulatto and carried a heavy cane, or rather club, in his hand. I did not like his appearance, and the idea of a familiar conversation with anyone seemed to terrify me. I determined to watch my companion closely, and he appeared equally intent on observing me. But at the same time that he walked with me, he was constantly drawing closer to and following behind me. The conduct increased my suspicion, and I began to wish to get rid of him, but could not at the moment imagine how I should effect my purpose. Sorry. To avoid him, I crossed the road several times, but still he followed me closely. The moon, which shone brightly upon our backs, cast its shadow far before me, and enabled me to perceive his motions with the utmost accuracy. Without turning my head towards him, he carried his club under his left arm, and at length raised his right hand gently, took the stick by the end, and drawing it slower over his head, was in the very act of striking a blow at me, when springing backward and raising my own staff at the same moment. Oh, he about to fight. I brought him to the ground by a stroke on his forehead, and when I had him down, beat him over the back and sides with my weapon until he roared for mercy and begged me not to kill him. I left him in no condition to pursue me and hastened on my way, resolved to get as far from him before day as my legs could carry me. This man was undoubtedly one of those wretches who are employed by white men to kidnap and betray such unfortunate people of color as may chance to fall into their hands. But for once the deceiver was deceived, and he who intended to make prey of me had well nigh fallen a sacrifice himself. The same night I crossed, man, there's a lot of river. I crossed the Pamunkey River, near the village of Hanover by swimming, and secreted myself before day in a dense cedar thicket. The next night, after I had traveled several miles in ascending a hill, I saw the head of a man rise on the opposite side without having heard any noise. I instantly ran into the woods and concealed myself behind a large tree. Had not heard behind a large tree. The traveler was on horseback, and the road being sandy and his horse moving only at a walk, I had not heard his approach until I saw him. He also saw me, for when he came opposite the place where I stood, he stopped his horse in the road and desired me to tell him how far it was to some place, the name of which I have forgotten. As I made no answer, he again repeated the inquiry, and then said I need not be afraid to speak, as he did not wish to hurt me, but no answer being given him, he at last said I might as well speak, and rode on. Before day, I reached the Mattapony River and crossed it by wading, but knowing that I was not far from Maryland, I fell into a great indiscretion and forgot the wariness and caution that had enabled me to overcome obstacles and apparently insurmountable. Anxious to get forward, I neglected to conceal myself before day, but traveled until daybreak before I saw the place of concealment, and unfortunately, when I looked for a hiding place, none was at hand. This compelled me to keep on the road until gray twilight for the purpose of reaching a wood that was in view before me. But to gain this wood, I was obliged to pass a house that stood at the roadside. And when only about 50 yards beyond the house, a white man opened the door and, seeing me in the road, called to me to stop. As this order was not obeyed, he set his dog upon me. The dog was quickly vanished by my stick, and setting off to run at full speed, I at the same moment heard the report of a gun and received its contents in my leg, chiefly about in my hams. I fell on the road and was soon surrounded by several persons who it appeared were a part of patty rollers who had gathered together in his house. They ordered me to cross my hands with, he came all the way, I'm sorry. This man made all the way to Virginia to get caught up. This is some, okay, sorry. Back to the patty rollers. Where am I? So he gets shot in the leg. They ordered me to cross my hands, which order not being immediately obeyed, they beat me with sticks and stones until I was almost senseless and entirely unable to make resistance. They then bound me with cords and dragged me to my feet, by my feet to the house, and threw me into the kitchen like a dead dog. One of my eyes was almost beaten out, and the blood was running from my mouth, nose, and ears. But in this condition, they refused to wash the blood from my face or even to give me a drink of water. In a short time, a justice of the peace arrived, and when he looked at me, ordered me to be unbound and to have water to wash myself, and also some bread to eat. This man's heart appeared not to be altogether void of sensibility, for he reprimanded in harsh terms those who had beaten me, and told them that their conduct was brutal, and that it would have been more humane to kill me outright than to bruise and mangle me in the manner they had done. He then interrogated me as to my name, place of abode, place of destination, and afterwards demanded the name of my master. To all these inquiries, I had made no reply, except that I was going to Maryland, where I lived. The justice told me it was his duty under the law to send me to jail, and I was immediately put into a cart and carried to a small village called Bowling Green, which I reached before 10 o'clock. There I was locked up in jail, and a doctor came to examine my leg, extract the shot from my wounds. In the course of the operation, he took out 34 buckshot, and after dressing my leg, left me to my own reflections. No fever followed in the train of my distresses, which I attributed to the reduced state of my blood by long fasting and the fatigues I had undergone. We almost finished here. This was a kind of a long chapter. We almost finished chapter 18. In the afternoon, the jailer came to see me and brought me my daily allowance of provisions and a jug of water. The provisions consisted of more than a pound of cornbread and some boiled bacon. As my appetite was good, you know, he likes that, I immediately devoured more than 2/3 of this food, but reserved the rest for my supper. For several days, I was not able to stand, and in this period found great difficulty in performing the ordinary offices of life for myself. No one coming to give me any aid, but I did not suffer for want of food, the daily allowance of the jailer being quite sufficient to appease the cravings of hunger. After I grew better and was able to walk in the jail, the jailer frequently called to me and endeavored to prevail on me to tell where I came from. But in this undertaking, he was no more successful than the justice had been in the same business. I remained in the jail more than a month, and this time became quite fat and strong, but saw no way by which I could escape. The jail was of brick, the doors was of solid oak boards, and the door of the same material was secured by iron bolts let into the posts and connected together by a strong band of iron reaching from one to the other. Everything appeared sound and strong until, add to my security, my feet were chained together from the time my wounds were healed. This chain I acquired the knowledge of removing from my feet by working out its sockets a small iron pin that secured the bolt that held the chain round one of my legs. The jailer came to me with great regularity every morning and evening, but remained only a few minutes when he came, leaving me entirely alone all other times. When I had been in prison 39 days and had quite recovered from the wounds that I had received, the jailer was late in coming to me with my breakfast, and going to the door, I began to beat against it with my fist for the purpose of making a noise. After beating some time against the door, I happened by mere accident to strike my fist against one of the posts, which to my surprise, I discovered by its sound to be a mere hollow shell encrusted with a thin coat of sound timber, and as I struck it, the rotten wood crumbled to pieces within. On a more careful examination of this post, I became satisfied that I could easily split it in pieces by the aid of the iron bolt that confined my feet. The jailer came with my breakfast and reprimanded me for making a noise. This day appeared as long to me as a week had done heretofore. But night came at length, and as soon as the room in which I was confined had become quite dark, I disentangled myself from the irons which I was bound, and with the aid of the long bolt, easily wrenched from its place the large staple that held. Don't do that. I'm sorry. The baby has taken my water and put paper in it. Where was I? Sorry. I missed my place. Oh. It had become dark, I disentangled myself from the irons with which I was bound, and with the aid of the long bolt, easily wrenched from its place the large staple that held one end of the bar, and lay across the door. The halves that held the lock in its place were drawn away amongst almost without force, and the door swung open on its own weight. I now walked out into the jail yard and found that all was quiet and that only a few lights were burning in the village windows. At first, I walked slowly along the road, but soon quickened my pace and ran along the highway until I was more than a mile from the jail. Then, taking to the woods, I traveled all night in a northern direction. At the approach of day, I concealed myself in a cedar thicket, where I lay until the next morning without anything to eat. On the second night after my escape, I crossed the Potomac at Howe's Ferry in a small boat that I found tied at the side of the ferry flat, and on the night following crossed the Patuxent in a canoe which I found chained at the shore. About 1 o'clock in the morning, I came to the door of my wife's cabin. Oh my goodness. This dude, let me read that again and slowly because this has been a journey. Let me slow down. About 1 o'clock in the morning, I came to the door of my wife's cabin and stood there. I believe more than 5 minutes before I could summon sufficient fortitude to knock. I at length rapped lightly on the door and was immediately asked if I knew, in the well-known voice of my wife, "Who is there?" I replied, "Charles." She then came to the door and opened it slowly and said, "Who is this that speaks so much like my husband?" I then rushed into the cabin and made myself known to her, but it was some time before I could convince her that I was really her husband returned from Georgia. The children were there called up, but they had forgotten me. When I attempted to take them in my arms, they fled from me and took refuge under the bed of their mother. My eldest boy, who was 4 years old when I carried away, still retained some recollections of once having had a father, but could not believe that I was that father. My wife, who was at first was overcome by astonishment at seeing me again in her cabin, and was incapable of giving credit to the infidelity of her vision, after I had been in the house a few minutes, seemed to awake from a dream and gathered all 3 of her children in her arms and thrust them into my lap as I sat in the corner, clapped her hands, laughed, cried by turns, and in her ecstasy forgot to give me any supper, until I at length told her that I was hungry. Before I entered the house, I felt as if I could eat anything in the shape of food. But now that I attempted to eat, my appetite had fled, and I sat up all night with my wife and children. When on my journey, I thought of nothing but getting home and never reflected that when at home, I might still be in danger. But now that my toils were ended, I began to consider with myself how I could appear in safety in Calvert County when everybody must know that I was a runaway slave. With my heart thrilling with joy when I looked upon my wife and children, who had not hoped ever to behold me again, yet fearful of coming of daylight, which must expose me to be arrested as a fugitive slave, I passed the night between the happiness of the present and the dread of the future. In all the toil, dangers, sufferings of my long journey, my courage had not forsaken me, The hope of again seeing my wife and little ones had borne me triumphantly through perils that even now I reflect upon some extravagant dream. But when I found myself at rest under the roof of my wife, the object of my labors attained, and no motive to arouse my energies or give them the least impulse, that firmness of resolution which had long sustained me suddenly vanished from my bosom, and I passed the night with my children around me, oppressed by a melancholy foreboding of my future destiny. The idea that I was utterly unable to afford protection and safeguard to my own family, and was myself even more helpless than they, tormented my bosom with alternate throbs of affection and fear, until the dawn broke in the east and summoned me to decide upon my future conduct. In the morning, I went to the great house and showed myself to my master and mistress. He is serious. They gave me a good breakfast and advised me at first to conceal myself, but afterwards to work in the neighborhood for wages. For 8 years I lived in this region of country and experienced a variety of fortune. At last I saved near $400 and bought near Baltimore 12 acres of land and yoke of oxen and 2 cows, and attended the Baltimore market. I had the great misfortune to lose my wife. I married in 2 years of my second wife. Wait, I had the great misfortune to lose my wife. I married in 2 years, and of my second wife had 4 children. 10 years of happiness and comparative ease I enjoyed on my little farm, and I had settled down into contentment, little fearing any more trouble, but a bad fate was before me. That's the end of the reading of chapter 18. We have 19 and 20. So he finally reaches back. He gets to his wife and children. They didn't recognize him. The wife dies shortly thereafter. He went to his master and his former master and mistress, and he was able to live within the neighborhood. Um, wow, that's all I gotta say. This thing is taking a turn. So we at chapter 18. You think it was happily after, but we got 2 more chapters to go. And he says bad fate is before him. So tune in on Sunday, because tomorrow we won't read tomorrow. We won't read Saturday. We'll read Sunday. That's the last day, the 31st day of January. Thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for sticking through the technical difficulties. If you're listening to this on replay, no worries about that. I hope you've enjoyed this thus far, because I surely have. And join us while we wrap this up on Sunday. So until next time, thank everybody for tuning in. My name is Amuna Yisrael, and share with someone, because it can be a very helpful experience. So until next time, everybody have a blessed night. Shalom.